Kirevel stared at her reflection in the polished metal wall of her new quarters at the Earth-Nexarian embassy. Her crystalline scales caught the artificial light, sending tiny rainbow patterns dancing across the room. At 10 feet tall, she had to bend slightly to see her entire face in the reflection. Even among her own people, she was considered unusually large. "Greetings, honored representatives of Earth," she practiced again, trying to make her deep voice sound softer. The translator device at her throat hummed quietly, converting her natural crystalline chimes into human speech. "I am diplomatic envoy Kirevel of Nexar." She sighed, watching her scales dim slightly with her mood. Most Nexarians stood at 8 feet tall, their scales a uniform blue-white. But she had been born different: towering height, iridescent scales that changed colors with her emotions, and a face structure that was too sharp, too angular even by Nexarian standards. A gentle chime from her communication panel interrupted her thoughts. "Envoy Kirevel, the welcome ceremony begins in 30 Earth minutes," the automated system announced. Her scales flickered with anxiety, shifting to a pale green. This was her first major assignment, a chance to prove herself to the Nexarian High Council. They had chosen her for this position, not because of her skills, but because humans were known to be unusually accepting of physical differences. The council probably thought she would be less of an embarrassment here than in any other diplomatic post. Kirevel moved to her personal storage unit and removed her formal diplomatic mantle. The silvery fabric was designed to drape over her shoulders and cascade down her back, partially covering her scales. She had specifically requested extra fabric to ensure maximum coverage. As she prepared, she recalled her mother's words from their last communication. "Remember, daughter, you represent all of Nexar now. Try to minimize your presence." Minimize. The word that had followed her throughout her life. Minimize your height. Minimize your colors. Minimize your voice. Be less. Take up less space. Be less noticeable. The mantle settled around her shoulders, and she activated its subtle gravity controls to keep it in place. Next came the ceremonial sash, marked with the symbols of her diplomatic rank. At least these she had earned through genuine merit. Top of her class in xenopolitics, fluent in 12 Earth languages even before the translator, and a perfect score in cultural adaptation studies. A small smile tugged at her angular features as she remembered her instructor's words. "Your understanding of other species' perspectives is remarkable, Kirevel, perhaps because you know what it means to be different." She straightened to her full height, her head nearly brushing the 12-foot ceiling. The welcome ceremony would include 20 human diplomats, 10 Nexarian officials, and representatives from 3 other alien species. All of them would be looking at her, judging her, wondering why someone so obviously unusual had been chosen for this position. "I am diplomatic envoy Kirevel of Nexar," she repeated one final time, watching her scales shift to a professional blue-white. She had spent years learning to control their color, to maintain this acceptable shade regardless of her emotions. "I am honored to serve as a bridge between our worlds." The communication panel chimed again. 15 minutes remaining. Kirevel took one last look at her reflection. The mantle couldn't hide her height or the sharp angles of her face, but at least it muted the ever-changing colors of her scales. She would do her duty, represent her people, and try her best to be what everyone wanted her to be. Less noticeable, less unusual, less herself. She ducked slightly to pass through the doorway of her quarters. It was time to face her new role, her new life among the humans. Whatever their reaction to her appearance, she would maintain her diplomatic composure. After all, she had spent her entire life learning to handle being seen as a monster. What she didn't know was that her first day on Earth would begin to change everything she believed about herself. Dr. Marcus Chen was running late to the diplomatic reception. He hurried through the embassy's corridors, straightening his tie as he walked. As Earth's newest cultural attaché, being late to his first major event wasn't the best start. He burst into the grand reception hall and stopped in his tracks. The room was filled with various diplomatic representatives, but his eyes were immediately drawn to the tallest figure in the room. A Nexarian diplomat stood near the far wall, her crystalline scales catching the light in a way that made the air around her shimmer with subtle rainbow colors. Unlike the other Nexarians he'd studied in his briefing materials, this one was different. Taller, more angular, with scales that seemed to shift colors ever so slightly. She was trying to make herself smaller, he noticed, hunching her shoulders beneath an oversized diplomatic mantle. Marcus checked his tablet quickly. That must be Envoy Kirivel, the new Nexarian representative. He made his way across the room, genuinely curious about the unique patterns he could see in her scales. Envoy Kirivel, he said, approaching her with a warm smile. I'm Dr. Marcus Chen, Earth's cultural attaché. I apologize for missing your introduction earlier. Kirivel turned, clearly surprised that someone was directly addressing her. Most of the other diplomats had been keeping a noticeable distance. Dr. Chen, she responded, her translator converting her crystalline tones into clear English. There is no need for apologies. She seemed to be trying to shrink herself even further, despite her impressive height. Marcus tilted his head, studying the way her scales shifted color slightly. I hope this isn't too forward, but I've never seen scale patterns quite like yours. The way they reflect light is fascinating. Is it a regional variation among your people? Kirivel's scales flickered briefly with a pink tinge before she forced them back to their diplomatic blue-white. No one had ever asked about her scales with such genuine interest before. I am unique among my people, she said carefully. Most Nexarians have uniform coloring. Well, it's beautiful, Marcus said simply. The way the colors shift, it's like watching the aurora borealis. We have these amazing light displays on Earth, in the polar regions. Different elements in the atmosphere create different colors when they interact with solar radiation. Kirivel's scales flickered again, this time with hints of gold, a color Marcus hadn't seen before. He watched, fascinated, as the patterns shifted. You are not uncomfortable with my appearance? She asked quietly. Marcus looked genuinely confused. Uncomfortable? Why would I be? Earth's cultures have such diverse ideas of beauty. In some of our cultures, iridescent colors are considered sacred. In others, height is seen as a blessing. He smiled again. Besides, as a scientist, I find unique characteristics incredibly interesting. Before Kirivel could respond, another diplomat called Marcus away. But as he left, he turned back to her. I'm working on the cultural exchange program. Perhaps we could meet tomorrow to discuss some ideas. I'd love to learn more about Nexarian culture from someone with such a unique perspective. Kirivel watched him walk away, her scales now showing swirls of colors she hadn't allowed herself to display in public for years. For the first time in her diplomatic career, someone had looked at her with neither fear nor polite tolerance, but with genuine appreciation. She straightened up slightly, letting her mantle fall more naturally around her shoulders. Across the room, she could see Dr. Chen already engaged in animated conversation with a group of diplomats, his hands moving expressively as he talked. He glanced back at her once and smiled again, causing her scales to shimmer with new colors. Maybe, just maybe, Earth would be different from what she had expected. And maybe, for the first time in her life, being different wouldn't mean being alone. The embassy's cultural center was quiet in the early morning hours. Kirivel sat at a specially reinforced desk, reviewing Earth's historical documents on her tablet. Her scales flickered with soft blue lights as she read about ancient civilizations and their varied beauty standards. The door slid open, and Marcus walked in carrying 2 containers. Good morning. I brought coffee for me and that mineral water you like. The one with extra calcium. Kirivel's scales brightened slightly. That is very thoughtful of you, Dr. Chen. Marcus, he reminded her with a smile. We've been working together for 2 weeks now. I think we can drop the formalities. He pulled up a chair, not seeming to mind that he had to look up at her. Most people either stood far back or found excuses to have her sit down. Marcus just accepted their height difference as natural. "I've been reading about Earth's beauty standards," Kirivel said, gesturing to her tablet. "It's quite surprising. Some cultures considered very tall people to be closer to their gods." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "And in ancient Egypt, they used to paint their eyes with bright colors. The Maori people of New Zealand created intricate facial tattoos that told their life stories. Beauty has never been just one thing on Earth." Kirivel's scales shifted to a thoughtful purple. "On Nexar, uniformity is considered beautiful. Those who are different—" She stopped, her scales dimming slightly. "Tell me about Nexarian art," Marcus said, changing the subject. He had noticed how her scales dulled whenever she talked about her homeworld. "I've seen some examples in the embassy, but I'd love to hear more." Kirivel's scales brightened again. "Our traditional art forms focus on crystal shaping. Artists use their natural resonance to create patterns within clear crystals." She hesitated, then added softly, "I used to practice it before joining the diplomatic service." Marcus leaned forward, interested. "You're an artist? That's amazing. Would you show me sometime?" "I haven't created anything in years," he admitted. "My resonance frequency is different from other Nexarians. It creates unusual patterns." "Unusual like your scales?" Marcus asked gently. "Because I think they're incredible. The way they change with your emotions, telling a story without words. Isn't that what art is supposed to do?" Kirivel's scales rippled with gold and pink before she could control them. Marcus watched the colors dance across her crystalline skin, not hiding his fascination. "You know," he said, pulling out his own tablet, "I've been studying Nexarian culture too. Did you know that before the age of uniformity, your people celebrated individual crystal patterns? There are ancient Nexarian poems about warriors whose scales shone in unique colors." He showed her the historical texts he found. Kirivel leaned closer, her scales pulsing with surprise. "I was never taught this in our history classes. Every culture goes through changes," Marcus explained. "What's considered beautiful shifts over time, but that doesn't mean the old standards were wrong." Just then, another diplomat entered the room. Kirivel straightened quickly, her scales shifting back to their diplomatic blue-white. But Marcus noticed she didn't hunch her shoulders as much as she used to. "We have that cultural exchange presentation next week," he said as they gathered their materials. "Would you consider maybe showing some crystal shaping? I think the Earth representatives would love to see it." Kirivel was quiet for a moment, her scales swirling with mixture of anxiety and hope. "Perhaps," she said finally, "if you think they would understand." "They will," Marcus assured her. "And if they don't, that's their loss. Art isn't about understanding everything. It's about seeing beauty in new forms." As they walked out, Kirivel realized her scales had settled into a new pattern, still unique, but no longer trying to hide their natural shimmer. Like Earth's auroras that Marcus had mentioned, perhaps there was beauty in being different after all. The warning sirens blared through the Earth Nexarian embassy without warning. Kirivel was in the middle of her crystal-shaping demonstration when the first tremors shook the building. Her scales flashed bright red with alarm. "Everyone remain calm," she said, her translator struggling to keep up with her rapid crystalline tones. "Please proceed to the emergency exits." Marcus rushed into the exhibition hall. "There's been an accident in the embassy's power core," he called out. "The containment field is failing." The room erupted into panic. Diplomats and visitors rushed toward the exits, creating chaos. Kirivel's height allowed her to see over the crowd and spot the danger immediately. The power surge was causing the building's crystal support columns to crack. "Marcus," she called out, "the eastern exit is about to collapse." He understood immediately and began redirecting people to other exits. But then they both heard it. Cries for help from the eastern corridor. 3 human diplomats were trapped behind a fallen beam. "The emergency teams won't get here in time," Marcus said, his face pale with worry. The building shook again. Kirivel looked at the corridor. The intense heat from the failing power core would be deadly to humans, but her crystalline body could withstand it better. For once, being different might save lives. "Keep everyone moving toward the western exits," she told Marcus. Without waiting for a response, she ducked through the doorway and ran toward the trapped humans. The heat was intense, making her scales vibrate uncomfortably. She found the diplomats huddled behind a fallen support beam, the corridor ahead of them blocked by debris. "Stay back," one of them shouted when they saw her approach. "The heat cannot harm me as easily as it would harm you," she finished, her scales glowing bright orange from the temperature. She reached for the fallen beam. Her extra height and strength let her lift the beam just enough. "Quickly," she urged them. "Crawl through." One by one, they slid past her. Just as the last one made it, another tremor shook the building. Kiravel felt something strike her back, and pain flared across her scales. She stumbled out after the diplomats, guiding them to safety. By the time they reached the western exit, emergency teams had arrived. Marcus was waiting outside, his face breaking into a relieved smile when he saw her. "You're hurt," he said, noticing the damaged scales on her back. "It will heal," she said, though she knew the scarring would be permanent. Her scales would never shine quite the same way again in those spots. The 3 diplomats she had saved approached her. She braced herself for their reaction. She must look frightening now, with her scales glowing orange from the heat and parts of them cracked and damaged. "You saved our lives," one of them said simply. "Thank you, Envoy Kiravel. Your quick thinking and unique abilities prevented what could have been a terrible tragedy," another added. Kiravel's scales shifted through several colors as she processed their words. They weren't seeing a monster. They were seeing someone who had helped them. Marcus stepped closer, carefully examining her injured scales. "These will need treatment," he said softly. "But you know what? They tell a story now. A story of bravery." "They're damaged," she replied, her voice quiet. "Imperfect. Perfect things don't save lives," Marcus said. "Perfect things don't run into burning buildings to help others. Perfect things don't make history." He smiled up at her. "The rescuers are saying if you hadn't acted so quickly, those support columns would have collapsed completely. Your height let you see the danger in time. Your unique scales let you withstand the heat. Your differences just saved 12 lives, including those 3 diplomats." For the first time in her life, Kiravel looked at her reflection in a nearby window and didn't try to hide her unusual height or her now scarred scales. Today, being different hadn't been a flaw. It had been a gift. 2 weeks after the embassy incident, Kiravel sat alone in her private workshop. Her scales, still bearing scars from the rescue, shimmered softly in the dim light. In front of her sat a large crystal, untouched for years. She raised her hands, letting her natural resonance flow. The crystal began to glow, responding to her unique frequency. Inside it, patterns began to form, not the traditional straight lines of Nexarian art, but swirling, dancing shapes that matched the colors of her scales. A knock at the door made her jump. "Come in," she called, expecting another medical checkup. Instead, Marcus stepped in, carrying a small box. He stopped, staring at the glowing crystal in wonder. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to interrupt. This is incredible." Kiravel's scales flushed pink with embarrassment. "It's not traditional," she said softly. "My resonance creates unusual patterns." Marcus moved closer, studying the swirling lights inside the crystal. "It's like watching emotions take shape," he said. "The way the colors flow and change. It's like your scales, but captured in crystal. On Nexar, this would be considered flawed," she explained, her scales dimming slightly. "Crystal art should be precise, geometric. You know what this reminds me of?" Marcus set down his box and pulled out his tablet. He quickly brought up images of earth art, swirling paintings by Van Gogh, flowing sculptures by Gaudi, abstract modern art pieces. On Earth, Some of our most celebrated artists broke away from traditional styles, he explained. They saw beauty differently, and in doing so, they created something new and wonderful. Kirivol's scales brightened as she looked at the earth artwork. These were accepted, celebrated. More than that, Marcus smiled. They changed how people saw art. He paused, looking thoughtful. Would you consider showing your crystal art publicly? Her scales flashed with anxiety. I couldn't. The embassy is hosting an Earth Nexarian cultural exhibition next month, Marcus continued gently. After what you did during the crisis, people want to know more about you. This could be a perfect opportunity. He opened the box he'd brought, revealing a small crystal she'd shaped weeks ago and forgotten about. The pattern inside was a delicate dance of colors, like an aurora caught in glass. I found this in the debris after the accident, he said. It survived because of how you shaped it. Your unique resonance made it stronger than traditional patterns, just like how your unique qualities saved those people. Kirevol stared at the small crystal, watching its colors pulse in sync with her scales. You really think humans would want to see my art? I think they'd love it, Marcus said firmly. And maybe some Nexarians would too. Sometimes we need to see things through others' eyes to recognize their beauty. Over the next few days, Kirevol created more crystals. Each one captured different emotions. Joy swirled in gold, courage burned in bright orange, hope shimmered in soft blue. Her scales' scars created new, unexpected harmonics in her resonance, adding depth to the patterns she'd never achieved before. The day before the exhibition, as she arranged her crystals in the embassy's gallery, a young Nexarian diplomat approached her. Is it true? The younger diplomat asked quietly. You also have changing scales. Kirevol turned, seeing the subtle color shifts in the young diplomat's scales, hidden under a thick ceremonial robe. Yes, she answered, standing tall. Would you like to learn about crystal shaping? My way. For the first time, Kirevol saw her differences not as flaws to hide, but as gifts to share. Her unusual resonance, her changing scales, even her scars, they were all part of the art she created, the story she told. And thanks to a human who saw beauty where others saw flaws, she was finally ready to tell that story. The exhibition had been open for a week when the High Council delegation arrived from Nexar. Kirevol was showing a group of human children how crystal shaping worked, her scales glowing warmly as they watched in wonder. Envoy Kirevol, the cold voice interrupted. A moment of your time. She turned to see Council Member Vextan, one of Nexar's most traditional leaders. He stood with two other council members, their scales a perfect, unchanging blue-white. Of course, council member, she said, straightening to her full height. She no longer tried to appear smaller. The children reluctantly left, one small girl waving goodbye. Kirevol's scales flickered with a gentle golden light as she waved back. This display is unprecedented, Vexton said, looking around at her crystal art with obvious disapproval. And your scales. You're not even trying to maintain proper diplomatic color control anymore. The humans appreciate authentic expression, Kirevol replied carefully. They find beauty in diversity. You are not human, Envoy, another council member cut in. You are Nexarian. Your duty is to represent our culture, not create some hybrid abomination. Kirevol's scales flashed deep red before she could stop them. My art has opened new diplomatic channels. 3 other embassies have requested exhibitions. Art. Vex 10 scoffed. These emotional displays are not art. And your behavior during the crisis, running into danger, exposing your abilities. You've made yourself a spectacle. She saved lives. Marcus's voice came from behind them. He walked up to stand beside Kirevol, not backing down from the council member's cold stares. Dr. Chen, Vexton said dismissively, this is a Nexarian matter. This is a diplomatic matter, Marcus corrected. Envoy Kirevol's actions and art have done more for Earth-Nexar relations than 100 traditional ceremonies. Kirevel felt her scales warming with gratitude, but Vextan wasn't finished. "We have already chosen your replacement," he told her. "Someone more suitable. Someone who understands the importance of proper Nexarian behavior." For a moment, the old fear gripped her. Her scales began to dim, trying to shift to that perfect diplomatic blue-white. Then she looked at her crystal artwork, each piece capturing emotions she'd hidden for so long. She saw the children's faces as they watched her shape crystal patterns. She remembered the young Nexarian diplomat who'd started learning her techniques. "No," she said quietly. "Excuse me." Vextan's scales flickered with shock before he controlled them. "I said no." Her voice grew stronger. "I am Nexarian. My height, my scales, my art, they are all Nexarian. Different does not mean wrong." "You forget your place," the third council member warned. "My place." Kirevel let her scales shine with every color she felt. "My place is here, showing that Nexarians can be more than one thing. That we can grow, change, create new forms of beauty. This human has filled your head with dangerous ideas," Vextan snapped, glaring at Marcus. "Marcus helped me see what was already there," Kirevel corrected. "Just as humans helped me see that being different can be a strength." The council members drew back, their scales showing brief flashes of confusion before returning to uniform blue-white. "You leave us no choice," Vextan said coldly. "You will be recalled to Nexar for re-education." Actually, Marcus stepped forward, holding up his tablet. According to the Earth-Nexar diplomatic treaty, any attempt to forcibly recall a diplomat for cultural expression violates Section 7, Paragraph 3. Earth would consider it a serious diplomatic incident. Vextan's scales finally lost their perfect control, flashing angry red. Without another word, the council members turned and left. Kirevel's scales swirled with a mix of emotions: fear, relief, pride, and something else he was just beginning to understand. "Thank you," she said to Marcus. He smiled up at her. "I just quoted the treaty. You did the hard part. You stood up for yourself." She looked around at her crystal art, each piece telling part of her story. "Yes," she said, her scales settling into a confident, shimmering pattern. "I suppose I did." Kirevel sat alone in the embassy's garden at midnight, watching Earth's moon cast silver light across her crystalline scales. A message cube from Nexar sat in her hands, glowing softly with an official seal. After the confrontation with the council members, she had received an unexpected offer. The Museum of Traditional Arts on Nexar wanted her as their new head curator. It was a prestigious position, far from Earth's influences. More importantly, it was a chance to be accepted among her own people. Her scales shifted to a thoughtful purple as she remembered the museum from her childhood. She had spent hours there, staring at the perfect geometric patterns, trying to make her own resonance match their precise lines. "I thought I might find you here." Marcus's voice broke through her thoughts. He sat down on the bench beside her, not commenting on the message cube she quickly tried to hide. "I received a job offer," she said finally, "on Nexar." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "A way for them to get you away from Earth without causing a diplomatic incident." Her scales flickered with surprise. He knew her people so well now. "It's actually a good position," she explained. "Head curator at the Traditional Arts Museum. Everything I once wanted: respect, acceptance, a chance to be part of the artistic community." "Once wanted?" Marcus asked gently. Kirevel stood up, her full height casting a long shadow in the moonlight. "I spent my whole life trying to fit into a space too small for me," she said. "Not just physically. I tried to make my art smaller, my voice quieter, my scales duller." She walked to a crystal sculpture she had created in the garden. In the moonlight, it caught and reflected her scale patterns, sending dancing colors across the grass. "Yesterday, a young Nexarian girl visited the exhibition," she continued. "She had height mutations like mine. Her parents were trying to get her surgical modifications to be shorter." Her scales flashed with emotion. She saw my art, saw me standing tall, and asked her parents if she could wait to decide about the surgery until she was older. Marcus smiled. You gave her a choice you never had. On Nexar, I could have a normal life, Kirival said softly. But here, she gestured to her crystal sculptures, to the embassy where humans and aliens work together, to the Earth City glowing in the distance. Here I can have an extraordinary one. She looked at the message cube again. The Council thinks Earth has changed me. Has it? No, she realized, her scales brightening. Earth didn't change me. It showed me who I already was, who I was always meant to be. She held up the message cube and with one swift movement, deactivated it. The official offer disappeared in a flash of light. What will you do now? Marcus asked. Stay, she said simply. Create art that bridges our worlds. Help others who feel different see their own beauty. Her scales swirled with determination. The Council wanted me here because they thought humans would accept anyone, no matter how unusual. They were right about that. But they never expected that acceptance to give me the strength to accept myself. And now, Kirival looked up at the stars, her scales shimmering with every color she once tried to hide. Now I choose to be exactly who I am. Not a perfect Nexarian, not an earth-changed diplomat. Just me, in all my contradictions and colors. The moonlight caught her scurred scales, creating new and beautiful patterns. She had finally learned that some things had to break their original shape to become what they were truly meant to be. Just like her art. Just like her. 6 months later, Kirival stood outside the newly built Interspecies Cultural Center. The building had been designed specifically for her height, with high ceilings and wide doorways. Crystal sculptures lined the entrance, each one telling a different story of acceptance and change. Her scales glowed with anticipation as she watched the diverse crowd gathering for the opening ceremony. Humans stood alongside aliens of all shapes and sizes. Among them, she spotted several young Nexarians, their scales showing subtle color changes they no longer try to hide. Marcus appeared beside her, carrying the speech tablet. Ready? He asked, smiling up at her. Almost, she replied, adjusting the new diplomatic mantle she had designed. Unlike her old one, this garment enhanced rather than hid her scales, with crystal threads woven through the fabric that caught and reflected their changing colors. She stepped onto the stage, her full 10-foot height visible to everyone. The crowd fell silent, but not from fear or discomfort, from anticipation. Welcome, she began, her translator carrying her voice clearly across the gathering. I see before me beings from 12 different worlds, each unique, each beautiful in their own way. Her scales shifted through rainbow colors as she spoke, and she let them. 1 year ago, I tried to make myself smaller, duller, more acceptable, she continued. I thought being different was a flaw to be hidden. Then humans taught me something extraordinary, that true beauty lies not in matching others' expectations, but in embracing who we are. She gestured to the crystal sculptures around them. These artworks were created by artists from different species, each using their unique abilities. The swirling patterns you see were shaped by my non-standard resonance. The geometric designs were crafted by traditional Nexarian artists. The color layers were added by a colorblind Centaurian who sees spectrums we cannot. Each piece is different. Each piece is perfect in its difference. In the crowd, she saw the young Nexarian girl who had questioned her surgery, standing tall and proud. Next to her, the young diplomat who had first asked about changing scales was displaying subtle color shifts openly. This cultural center is more than a building, Kirival said, her scales glowing brighter. It is a promise that no matter your height, your color, your shape, or your abilities, you will find acceptance here. A promise that being different is not a flaw to fix, but a gift to share. She looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. Humans have a saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I used to think it meant that only some would find beauty in the unusual. Now I understand. It means that true beauty is found when we learn to see ourselves through eyes unclouded by fear or prejudice. The crystal sculptures around her began to glow, responding to her emotional resonance. Today, we open not just a cultural center, but a new chapter in our world's history. A chapter where we celebrate our differences instead of hiding them, where we learn from each other instead of fearing each other, where being unique is not a burden, but a bridge between worlds. The crowd erupted in applause. Kirivol's scales shimmered with joy as she watched humans and aliens mingling, examining the art, sharing stories. She saw a council member Vextan in the back, his perfect blue-white scales showing just a hint of surprised color. Later, as she and Marcus walked through the center, watching visitors explore the exhibitions, he asked, "Was it worth it?" Choosing to stay, Kirivol looked around at what they had built, not just the center, but the community growing within it. Her scales glowed with warm, confident colors she had once been afraid to show. "Yes," she said simply, "because I didn't just choose to stay. I chose to become who I truly am. And in doing so, I helped others find the courage to do the same." Above them, Earth's sun shone through the crystal ceiling, casting rainbow patterns across the floor, beautiful, different, and perfectly themselves.